Hey guys, welcome to Brian's Man Cave. Well, I want to talk a little bit about kind of what the Atari Creep was talking about in his video that I watched today, and it was about I guess the second generation console wars and whether they actually there actually was a console war. Specifically, his whole thing was about the Atari versus the Intellivision. Because most recently we had this whole thing about Atari, the Atari name, essentially acquiring the Intellivision brand, and so now, we have the Atari, which is this is the Atari 2600 Donkey Kong. They now own Intellivision. This is the Intellivision Donkey Kong, and um, and so a lot of posts and people went nuts and started talking about the console war is over and Atari wins and so I was watching his video and I'm kind of like I sided with a lot of the things that he had to say, and it was mainly on the idea that when I was a kid, when I was growing up, I never even thought of it as any kind of war. Sure, there were the commercials. Obviously, the Atari had their commercials, and Intellivision had their commercials, or Mattel, I should say, had their commercials. The George Plimpton, and this, you could see the difference. But anyways, when I was a kid, I didn't even notice any of that stuff. It didn't matter to me. What I saw was, hey, this friend over there, they have an Atari. They're playing, Donkey Kong on Atari. That's cool. And then I went over to the other friend's house. They had a ColecoVision. This is a ColecoVision game. And I thought, hey, that's cool. Look at that. And, I myself, I grew up. I had Intellivision. I played my Donkey Kong on the Intellivision. I was perfectly fine with it. I never looked at it like, oh, this one's better than this one, and this one's better than that one, and, sure, I saw graphics, and I went, hey, the ColecoVision looks really good. The Atari one, not so good. The Intellivision one, meh, based on the game. But it never really mattered to me. It never really came down to, this is a war of consoles. And I think, at that time, we also have to think about money and cost. The Atari at that time was a lot more affordable as a console, as a system, and the games than buying the Intellivision or buying the ColecoVision in the later days. It just, to a lot of people, the Intellivision was out of reach. It was like over $100 more to buy the Intellivision. And the games, I'm not sure that the game differences, the game prices, I'm sure there was a difference, but you have to remember too, Atari had a lot more property, it had a lot more stuff. They had a ton more games. A lot of them might not have been great games. If you were to compare the difference in, say, quality of games between the Intellivision and the Atari had a hell of a lot more games, and a lot of them were just not good. Whereas the Intellivision had a small list of games, and a lot of them were pretty decent. The graphics were great, the sound was great. Yeah, there was a difference in, say, licensing and the Atari, like I was saying, with Donkey Kong, but the Atari seemed to be more into the, we had Pac-Man, we had Qbert, we had, a lot of the Centipede, a lot of the arcade titles, the popular arcade titles of the day. Atari got those licenses, and so for the Intellivision, they had to improvise. They had, instead of Space Invaders, they had Space Armada. It was the same style of game, a little bit different, but it was this, you could see it was the same. They had Lock and Chase, instead of Pac-Man. There was, like, yeah, sure, some of these titles ended up on the Intellivision a little bit later on, as licensing started to move. But in all fairness, though, even the Pac-Man game for the Intellivision was made by Atari Soft. So it was Atari still putting it on the Intellivision. And that, that takes me to another thing. Back then, it didn't matter that, your product ended up on another console. I always like to use this as an example. I was showing this one earlier, obviously. I've been talking about this for a long time. This is the Intellivision Donkey Kong. This was made by Coleco. And it's Donkey Kong, which is owned by Nintendo. So you gotta let that sink in for a second here. We got Nintendo's game put out by Coleco on the Intellivision. It's weird, I know, but that was normal. I mean, obviously, when this came out, the Nintendo didn't have their own system yet. I mean, we're years before that. I think this was, if I could see this with my terrible eyes, 1982. So we're a few years before the first Nintendo system, which I have heard, or I remember learning about that. A Nintendo approached Atari with the notion of wanting to put out a console and for them to be the ones to put it out, and you know, there was decisions made and it never happened, and then, you know, is stuff like that. It's all hidden all in the history books, but it's just interesting how that type of stuff happened, that we ended up with these, you know, Atari games on Intellivision. Intellivision games ended up on Atari. We had that with Astro Blast. Astro Smash is a very popular Intellivision game. It's the one where you're kind of that thing that goes across the bottom of the screen, shooting up at asteroids coming down. If you watch The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon Cooper wore the Astro Smash T-shirt. But Atari, the Atari 2600, and when I'm saying Atari, I'm sorry, I'm meaning the Atari 2600, not all Atari, but the Atari 2600, or the VCS of the day, had games that were made by Intellivision people, like Astro Blast and Lock and Chase, and a few other games that they created. The Tron game, I believe. There was a few that Intellivision. I don't know what they were called. If there was INTV Corp at that time, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on what they called themselves at the time, but it was Intellivision products showing up on the Atari, and so I never really saw it as a war, because they were kind of all just incorporating their stuff everywhere, and us being the players, me being at the kid at the time, and I had my friends. I had my friend down the street who had a ColecoVision. I had my friend who had an Atari. I had my friend who had this, and we had a Commodore 64 over here and a VIC-20 over there. It's just the way it was, and I respected every single one of those consoles exactly the same way. I never looked at them as competitors. I just looked at them as like, these are different, and I'm still having fun. You know, I really didn't see the whole wars thing start to materialize until about the 90s, when we started getting things like the Sega and Nintendo competing against each other. And it was at that point more of a marketing thing, because that's when we started to hear about the bit wars. That was when we started hearing about the 8-bit versus the 16-bit. That's when we heard about the blast processing and the Sega CD, and it just always seemed to be like, Sega does what Nintendo don't. It was then it started to feel like there was this war, and that was more of a marketing tool, marketing tactic. At this point, things like the Atari, the Intellivision, the ColecoVision were almost like, at this point, dead. Like they were just, they weren't dead, but they were, down here. Some of them were fading. The Intellivision ended at some point. Atari was still making computers and stuff like that, but I mean, it just seems like the whole console thing was now just Nintendo and Sega. And then eventually we moved into PlayStation and all the rest from above. But, I always felt that kind of signaled, this is the war. This is where, are you a Nintendo person or are you a Sega person? And even myself, I was a Nintendo person. I had a Nintendo NES long before I had any Sega. I mean, I didn't care too much for the Sega. My cousin had a Master System, and I looked at it, and I didn't really care too much for it. Maybe it was the games. I didn't see, I think he had, Space Harrier and, one other game, and I just didn't see it. But when I saw the Nintendo, I was really thrilled. I liked the Super Mario game. I liked Tetris. There was a lot of games on the Nintendo I liked that I didn't see on the Sega. But then that kind of changed when the Genesis came out, and I started seeing things like the Tasmania game and Sonic the Hedgehog, and obviously some of those were a little bit more captivating to me, and I thought, hey, those look cool. And the bit thing, I don't think I fully at that time I fully even understood what that even meant. The 8-bit, 16-bit, whatever, 32-bit. I never even cared about that stuff. Anyways, yeah, I just wanted to talk about that because I thought it was an interesting topic. I was watching the Atari Creeps video today, and he was talking about it, and I thought this is an interesting thing to kind of throw my 2 cents, my point of view in, and that's how I grew up. That's what I thought. I still don't think that Atari won any kind of war. I think it's just Atari's there. They still see the Intellivision property has some, people still interested in it. There's a fan base, and let's keep it going. Let's resurrect it. Let's propel it and bring it out to the masses. That's what I see. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Anyways, let me know what you think. Throw some comments down below. Hope you subscribe. Talk to you later.